Well, good morning. It's Tuesday morning, and we are coming to you live to share with you some great truth from the book of Joshua. So, before we get started today, let me just introduce myself. My name is Christy Browning. I am an inspirational and motivational speaker, as well as a master developmental coach, meaning from the book of Joshua. So, before we get started today, let me just introduce myself.
Hold on a
My
second
name is
here.
Christy Browning. I am an Okay, sorry, we had a little technical difficulty there. Anyways, okay, so we are going through the book of Joshua, and like I was saying before, my name is Christy Browning, and I'm an inspirational and motivational speaker, as well as a master developmental coach. And what that means basically is I want to help you and people like you move ahead into the life, purpose, dreams, passions that God has designed for you. And so part of what I've been learning myself or been going through myself is studying the book of Joshua. I've been really uncovering the truths that God is showing the Israelite nation in the Old Testament about moving into that which He has promised them. So, if you're not familiar with the Israelite story, basically here's how it works. The Israelites were God's chosen people in the Old Testament, and they were previously they had been slaves in Egypt. God chose to use a man by the name of Moses to set them free and to lead them out of Egypt. And the whole concept with this is that the Israelites were going to then get to go live in the promised land that God had set aside for them. Moses was supposed to lead them there. Because of some bad choices and wrong decisions, Moses ended up not getting to the promised land, and the Israelites wandered the desert for 40 years, with Moses leading them kind of into nothing because of some of their wrongdoing. But when Moses died, God put Joshua in charge of the Israelite nation, and that's where the book of Joshua starts. Is with this guy named Joshua. He gets told, "Hey, now it's your turn to lead the Israelites, and guess what? I'm going to use you to bring them to the promised land." And so there's this whole process that takes place in the first couple of chapters of the book of Joshua. Where he is putting in place his plan and God's plan through Joshua to lead the Israelite nations into the promised land. And so today we're going to pick up our story in verse 6. And so what we're finding, or chapter 6, what we're seeing in chapter 6 is this. The Israelites are standing in front of the city of Jericho, and that city is keeping them from their promised land. And so they need to get those people out and overthrow the city in order for them to have their promised land. And in chapter 6, um, the book of Joshua, it says, "Now Jericho is a fenced town with high walls and was tightly closed because of the Israelites. So no one was going in and no one was going out." Basically, God had delivered the Israelites in such a mighty way up to this point that their story and what was happening to them and what God was doing for them was getting around. And the Jericho city heard of what God was doing, and they were a little nervous, and so they pretty much brought everyone within the city into the city walls, and they locked the gates, and no one was leaving and no one was coming in. They were kind of holed up there to keep themselves protected from this mighty movement that they felt was coming. And so, if you read any commentaries or any backstory about Jericho, you'll find out really quickly that Jericho, although is called a city, it's not ginormous like a city we would think of nowadays. The whole city walled area was only probably about 7 or 8 acres. It really wasn't a large piece of land, but it was an important piece of land. And so anyways, as we move forward in the chapter, we see that in verse 2, it says that the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho, its king, and its mighty men of valor into your hands. You shall march around the enclosure, all the men of war going around the city one time. This you shall do for 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns, and on the 7th day you will march around the enclosure 7 times, and the priests will blow their trumpets." So the plan was this: they need to overthrow the city of Jericho. But instead of going to war with them, God's plan is for Joshua to take the Ark of the Covenant, which was a gold fancy box that encompassed the Spirit of God, and it was kind of the major icon for the Israelite nation. And so the priests were to take the Ark of the Covenant, the priests, the men of war, and the Israelite nation, and they were supposed to walk around the city of Jericho one time for 6 days. On the 7th day, they were to walk around the city 7 times. And this was the plan. And it says that on the 7 times the priests blow their trumpets. And then as you read on through the story, the Israelite nation on the 7th time is supposed to yell when they hear the trumpets. And then God brought the walls down for them to take over the city. And so this is what they do. They walk up to the city, they walk around one day, they walk around 2 day, they walk around 3rd day, all through the first 6 days. And then the 7th day, they walk around 7 times. The priests blow their trumpets. The Israelite nation who's following them hears the trumpets, so they scream like crazy people. The walls of Jericho fall down, and then the people walk over the rubble and take the city. It was that simple. And I love the story. I love the story of Joshua anyways, but I really love this story, especially for where we're at in 2016. We're starting a brand new year, and so many of us start the year with goals and dreams and purposes that we want to see happen for us in 2016. And some of those may very well be God inspired. We know that God has told us this is what He wants from us, or He wants to do for us in the new year. And I am expecting my promised land to come to me in 2016. But there are some very specific instructions that we can see in this chapter 6 from Joshua's example that we can take to heart for ourselves and learn a great deal on how to make our advance into our promised land the way God would want us to do that. So let's just look at a couple of things. First of all, in verse 2, we see that the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho, its king and its mighty men, into your hand." God said, "I have given you Jericho." This wasn't a plan for the Israelites to take the city by storm. God did the work. God did the fighting for them. And God had already told Joshua, "I am doing this for you. You don't have to go it alone. You don't have to go blazing into the city with, this mighty plan. I am going to give you. I have given you." That's just what He says. "I have given you the city of Jericho." And so many times I think that we stand at the foot of this magical, big, ginormous thing we want in our lives, and we think we have to come up with some elaborate plan to conquer it. We have to come out with weapons blazing, and with all of the knowledge, and with all of the fancy schmancy tools or resources or the money to overcome and overtake and take over and conquer this that's we're standing in front of, that we feel like is ours. And so many times it's not what God wants. He is doing the work for us. He wants to give it to us. We just have to be patient and do that. So imagine if the Israelite nation had gone about this a different way. If they had gone up to the city walls and put a plan of attack in place that encompassed them taking over the city, busting down the gates, fighting with their swords and their arrows and hand-to-hand combat to take the city over, there probably would have been some lives lost. There would have been pain. There would have been struggle. It would have come at a great price for them to have it. But God wanted to give it to them in such a way that it was almost effortless. And I can imagine that, here sits Jericho and its men of valor and its king, and it's it knows the history that comes from the Israelite nation. And so when they hear they're advancing on their town or on their city, they're nervous enough to lock everybody in there. And yet, what do they see the Israelite nation do? Make a circle around their city. Like, that had to be so perplexing. They had to stand there and scratch their heads and go, what are these people doing? Where is the mighty force of God that we're expecting? And after day 2 or 3, I would imagine that the Jericho leaders and the Jericho city itself probably stood there and thought, okay, so let me guess, on day 4, you're going to walk around the city again, right? And so the whole idea of unexpectedness didn't happen with this story because they repeated the same plan 6 days in a row. It was a plan that wasn't even attacking. It was not threatening. Can you just imagine the city guards or whatever walking along the wall going, ooh, walking around the city, like, this had to be absolutely ridiculous to them, and in such a way that made zero sense to them. But Joshua knew that God had said, I am giving you the city. There was not any pain. There was not any great loss. There was not any great risk for the Israelites. They all had to do was just follow God's plan. And so for us in 2016, as we want to push and push and push to get where we want to go and accomplish what we want to accomplish and gain what that we want to gain. And that, like I said, that could be everything that God has promised us. And we know that God wants to give us a great business or great relationships or a great healing or to give us a great abundance. All of those things are promised to us as His children, but it's promised to us for His purpose and His time and in His way. And too often we want to advance ourselves. We want to say, okay, God, thanks for the promise. I'm going to go make it happen. And we run and we charge the city walls and the city gates and we fight and we fight. And what happens is we come back battle wounded and bruised and beat up and exhausted and defeated because we ran ahead and we did it. And so the next thing we see in verses 3 and 4 is the instructions that the Israelites walked one time for 6 days around the city, and then the 7th day they did 7 times. And this is really, like I said, not the smartest move on a military scope. Number one, it was predictable. Number two, it was not aggressive. It was very passive. It just was not heard of. I mean, it was ridiculous to the Jericho people. And I have to imagine that even some of the Israelites had to kind of step back and go, okay, not really sure what you're thinking here, Joshua, but okay. And really what this was about was God testing their patience and their faith. If you follow the Israelite story prior to Joshua taking over, they weren't the most patient people. They complained a lot. They pitched a lot of fits. And they kind of did it to themselves when it came to the whole wandering in the desert for 40 years and being delayed in their arrival of the promised land. And so this whole process was God saying, okay, you got a new leader. We got some things in place. You're starting to make some progress. Let's see if you're really in it for the right reasons and the right way that I want to bring this about. And so it was a little bit of a test and a little bit of patience, but God rewarded them in a huge way because He gave them control of the city in a way that didn't cost them hardly anything. Verses 8 and 9 is more instruction. Basically, what happens is God's told Joshua to set the circle up where trumpets, the priest and their trumpets would be the first in line. Then the Ark of the Covenant was behind them. Then the rear guards was behind that, and then the Israelite nation followed. So what's really interesting in this is a lot of times we read in the Old Testament where the Ark of the Covenant goes before the people. It's the first thing that leads out. In fact, when you look at chapters 2 and 3 of Joshua, where Joshua starts to lead the people out of the wilderness, what he tells them is the Ark of the Covenant is going to get up and go before you, and you should follow it. So even in that instance, the Ark of the Covenant went first. In this particular scenario, we see that the Ark of the Covenant, which is God's presence embodied or boxed in this great gold elaborate box, it is in the middle of this whole lineup. And I love that imagery because God could have chosen in this scenario to just cause a great wind to come and blow the walls down. And then all Jericho was rubble, and the Israelites could have walked in. And they didn't even have to be there. The Israelite nation didn't have to be there. God could have done this on his own. The Israelite nation could have tried to do it on their own, and they may have been successful, but again, it would have come at a great cost to them. But no, what God chose to do was put himself in the middle of what they were doing. Think about that. This wasn't God doing it without them or in spite of them. He wanted to use them and to be evident in them. The Israelites and Joshua as their leader chose to not do this cold thing of taking over Jericho without God. They knew they needed God. And so in the reality of this was a partnership that was one side that needed God, Israelites, and then the other side is God choosing to use the Israelites, choosing to be in the middle of them. And with God in the middle of it, there was success. With God in the middle of it, it was ordained. It was anointed. It was special, and it had special favor because he was in the middle. And so as we look at 2016 and we want to advance into that which God has promised us, I want to share with you again that we do it in the way that God had set for us, not charging the gates, not blowing down the walls, not going to battle, letting God do the work for us, but for us to be patient and for us to have faith to execute the plan in his way and in his time. And in these verses, we also see with him in the middle of it. Not us running ahead and then letting God catch up. Not sitting on the sidelines and letting God do everything and expecting that we can just walk in without a lot of faith on our part. No, there is a job for us to do, and there's also a job for God to do. And if we can get those straight and we know where we stop and where he starts, and he's in the middle of it, and we're following that leadership, that our promised land will be delivered to us in a way that is beneficial, that is the way God wants it, and with great blessing and glory from him. The last thing I think is really amazing in the story comes in verse 10. So here Joshua is telling the Israelites, which are hundreds and hundreds of people, that, hey, we're going to walk around the city once every 6 days, or once for 6 days, and then 7 times on the 7th day. And all of that time, I want you to be quiet. And then when I tell you, then you're going to shout. So verse 10 says, but Joshua commanded the people, you shall not shout or let your voice be heard, nor shall any word proceed out of your mouth until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout. So I love this because, you know, I'm a talker and sometimes my mouth gets me in trouble. And so this is such a great reminder to shut my mouth. You know, I think so many times that we want to speak, we want to spout off, we want to shout, we want to maybe even pitch a fit or complain or run our mouths about what we think God should be doing or what we think is going to happen. And you know, it would have been really easy for the Israelites to walk around that city and trash talk those people at Jericho because they knew what God had done for them. They knew what God was capable of. It would have been also very easy for them to walk around the city and complain and pitch a fit and run their mouths about each other and about what God said he was going to do, and maybe they lost faith and he didn't, or what Joshua said, maybe we don't trust him. And they could have ran their mouths. But the Israelite nation was commanded to not speak at all. It was the greatest version of the quiet game you have ever seen, right? Here they're walking around the city and there is no conversation. There is no shouting. There is no talking. Joshua says, you shall not shout or let your voice be heard, nor shall any word proceed out of your mouth until I tell you so. And that's a pretty big command. But in the end, it's what proved to be the final straw to bring the house down. When the 7th time happened on the 7th day, the priests blew their trumpets, and that was the signal for the Israelite nation to shout. And when they shouted out loud, it brought the walls down. And then what happened? The Israelites simply walked over the rubble and took over the city. It was that easy. And God did deliver the city to them, just like he said. But the Israelite nation had to be quiet. So many times, I think, as we are wanting so bad for God to do stuff in our lives, the patience factor, the stillness factor, the stand still and be silent part is really the hardest part. I think about the Israelites and them walking around the city. The effort of walking around the city really wasn't that big of a deal. They'd already walked the desert for 40 years, so what's a couple more days, right? And like I already said, the city wasn't ginormous. It was only 7 acres. They can make that track, and it would have been fine for them. But the hardest part of that probably had to have been the no talking rule. And I think for us, that's where our hiccup is the being quiet, being patient, being silent, and being that way so that we can trust that God is doing it, so that we can also hear and listen when God is doing it, and we can follow that. It would have been chaos if all of the Israelites would have been carrying on conversation and shouting and pitching a fit and creating all this noise. It would have been hard for some of those people to hear the commands and to know what was happening and to be able to follow the directions that were coming from those leading that charge. And so for us as believers today, I think as we stand at the gates of our promised land, we have to remember, number one, that God is going to do it. The more that we try to do it on our own, the more defeated that we are, the greater chances that we're going to screw it up and not get it anyways. We're going to feel battle bruised and wounded and exhausted and drained. When we would just step back and let Him do it for us and just do our part, man, it comes to us so much more effortlessly in that resolve. And then the second thing we have to remember, especially moving forward, is that what the world sees for us to do, or what the world thinks is logical in our taking our promised land and for us advancing into the life that God wants, doesn't have to make sense. Because God's got a different plan. Just like Joshua's military plan to walk around the city made zero sense to the Jericho city. Those people, I mean, they had to think that they were mental, but God had a different plan. And His plan always proves to be best. And so even when it doesn't make sense to the onlookers and those on the outside that are watching you do what you do every day to get where you're supposed to go, because you're following God's plan, it is not going to make sense to them. But you have faith in the fact that God's plan always works out. And then the second thing is that you have to know that, or the third thing, I'm sorry, is that you have to know that God's in the middle of it. You can't run ahead and you can't lag behind. It is a partnership, and you do it with His help, and He does it because He loves you enough to do it through you. And then lastly, remember, it's the patience factor. It's the stand still and be quiet. There's so many scriptures in the Bible that talk about silence, that talk about being still, and not necessarily being still like physically not moving, because obviously the Israelites were physically moving. They were walking around the city, but their spirits were quiet. Their mouths were quiet, literally, but their spirits were quiet. And so many times that's what we need in the midst of that, encompassing what God's doing for us and moving forward in what God's doing for us. Until we get there, a lot of times it's stillness in our spirit. We're patient to let God do it at His time. We are quiet so that we can hear His direction and His speaking into our hearts and our minds. And I will tell you that on all of these points, I fail all the time. And I have experienced these points, and when I have failed, the greatest is when I have greatly felt the pain of it. And it has cost me a lot in my life when I chose and choose to run ahead and to conquer my own battles and to try to make things happen in my own efforts and in my own time. But when there is that moment where God takes over and all I do is circle the city, all I do is follow Him and say, I don't really know what is exactly going to happen here. I'm just following you, and I'm trusting that the results are going to come through you, because you are the one that delivers the city, not Christy. God is the one that delivers your promises and your promised land to you, not you. It's your job to show up and circle the city. That's it. That's all you have to do. And whatever that might look like for you and where you're at, it's all God is asking for you. But that quietness is where you're going to hear the direction. Circle the city one more time. Now's the time to shout. It's hard to hear those directions, and it's hard to know that without that quietness in your heart and your spirit and that stillness and patience where we're waiting on Him to do it for us. So how do you do that on a day-to-day basis? What does that look like? Well, I'll tell you, doing stuff like this video is a great way. One of the best ways for you to stay in touch with what God is wanting to show you and teach you and the directions that He's wanting to give you is to stay plugged into Him on a daily basis. And again, this is something in the past that I have not always been the greatest at, but I'm telling you what, there is something that happens, some clarity and perspective that comes through daily Bible reading and daily prayer. And this doesn't mean that you have to go to a church building every day and do this. It doesn't have to take hours and hours of your day, but just a little bit of that time spent. The revelations that come and the ideas and the comfort and the direction that comes from that is ultimately God inspired, and that is what is leading you forward. I know for me personally right now, I feel like my company, Revision, which is the brand that I do my speaking and coaching underneath, is kind of in an evolution process, and we're making some changes, and we're trying to go forward and doing some new things. And it's a little bit scary because it's not in my comfort zone to make changes kind of like this. And there are some aspects of that are uncertain to me, and it's not really sure if I should go this way or if I should go that way, if I should structure things to the left or if I should structure things to the right. And so right now I'm still just circling. I'm just still circling the city until God says, hey, shout it out, because this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to deliver it to you. And so I'm standing there. I know when I went through my divorce, it was the hardest decision I made ever in my life, because it wasn't one that I wanted to make. I didn't believe in divorce. I didn't think that that was God's plan, but I knew the life that I was in and the relationship I was in wasn't God's plan either. And so something had to change. But I remember telling myself that in the process of making these really big, monumental, life-changing decisions, none of them were going to be made until I knew for certain that God was telling me what to do and His direction was telling me what to do. And so there were days and weeks and months that I just circled the city, basically, and in my own heart just stood still and didn't do anything but walk it out and just keep moving in my day-to-day routine until God said, hey, now's the time to shout. And then my promised land was given to me in that circumstance. And so I really encourage you in that way to say that there is no timetable when it comes to God. He is not held to a clock. He is not held to a schedule. 24 hours a day is no limit to Him, because He can do in a lifetime that which we can only dream of. And in just a couple of years, He could change the world through you. He isn't looking at your age. He's not looking at your bank account. He's not looking at the calendar, worried about getting His work done in the time and in the confines that we think. And so take those limitations off of your mind and trust that God is going to make it happen. He's going to deliver the promised land to you. He is going to, like Joshua was told in this chapter, I have given Jericho its king and mighty men of valor into your hands. God is going to do it for you in His way, in His timing, if we will just be patient enough to let Him do it. And if we'll put Him in the middle of it and we let Him bring the walls down and what it is that He wants to give us. This is my encouragement to you and to myself, because we have a great start this year. 2016 can be an amazing year, and we can be standing here next year saying, wow, look at the walls that God brought down and the ways that He delivered promises to us and gave us things that we never thought of, all because we chose to put Him in the middle and to follow His direction and to be patient as He delivers that to us. Imagine what that would look like for us all, and imagine the testimony that we would be able to offer because of what God has done. I hope that leaves you with some encouragement. I hope that gives you a little bit of a challenge to see how you can go about your year in a different way. I know God wants to give you the desires of your heart. I know that He wants to bless you in great ways. And it may mean circling the city 14 times and then some, but trust that God's plan is best and His timing is always perfect. I hope you have a fantastic rest of the week. We will be back on Thursday at 9 a.m. for another live broadcast where you can learn more and we can study more the book of Joshua together. And the next chapter has great stuff in it. I can't wait to share it with you. Thursday, 9 o'clock, right here on Google+. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you on Thursday.